Sometimes the hardest part for an avoidant isn't opening the door. It's waking up the next morning and remembering that someone saw what was behind it. Psychologists sometimes describe this kind of reaction as a vulnerability hangover. You say something personal. You reveal something you normally keep protected. For a moment, you feel understood, maybe even relieved. Then later, the emotional temperature changes. You start replaying what you said. Why did I tell them that? Did I say too much? Did they notice how affected I was? What do they think of me now? And suddenly, something that felt intimate the night before can feel strangely exposing the next morning. For someone with strong avoidant defenses, that feeling can become especially uncomfortable because the problem isn't necessarily that they regret trusting you. The problem is that you now know something they worked very hard to keep hidden. And once another person has seen behind the emotional wall, you can't completely put the moment back where it was. That is where the shame begins. The moment itself may not feel frightening. In fact, it can feel surprisingly good. An avoidant person may spend a long time keeping certain emotions contained. They don't necessarily lack those emotions. They may simply have become extremely practiced at managing them privately. So imagine that one evening, something slips through. Maybe they tell you about something that hurt them. Maybe they admit they were afraid. Maybe they tell you they missed you. Maybe they finally explain something they normally avoid discussing. Or perhaps they simply say, I care about you. And for a few minutes, the defenses become quieter. They don't have to manage everything. They don't have to appear completely unaffected. They don't have to maintain the image of being emotionally self-sufficient. Someone sees them, and they let themselves be seen. That can actually feel relieving, because vulnerability isn't always experienced as danger in the moment. Sometimes it feels like release. The nervous system has been holding something tightly, and suddenly, it doesn't have to hold it alone. But the emotional experience doesn't necessarily end when the conversation ends. This is where something interesting can happen. The person goes home. The room becomes quiet. The conversation is over, and their mind begins reviewing what happened. Not necessarily because anything went wrong, but because their internal monitoring system has switched back on. They remember the exact words, the tone of your voice, your reaction, the expression on your face, the moment they looked away, the moment they almost cried, the moment they admitted something they had never planned to say. And then comes the thought. They know that sentence can carry enormous psychological weight, because before that conversation, the feeling existed privately. It belonged to them. They controlled who had access to it. They could decide when to think about it. They could compartmentalize it. They could put it away. But now, another person has witnessed it, and that changes the psychological equation. This is one reason vulnerability can sometimes produce embarrassment or shame afterward. The person isn't necessarily ashamed of having feelings. They may be uncomfortable with the fact that those feelings became visible. There is a difference. You can be completely comfortable knowing something about yourself and still feel exposed when someone else knows it too. Think about the difference between crying alone and crying in front of someone. The emotion is the same, but the psychological experience isn't. When you're alone, you remain in control of the experience. When another person is present, you become aware of yourself being observed. That awareness can create self-consciousness. And for someone who has built a strong identity around emotional control, being emotionally observed can feel deeply unfamiliar. Suddenly, they aren't simply experiencing an emotion. They're watching themselves experience it. And that creates another layer. Self-monitoring. What did I look like? Did I seem weak? Did I need them too much? Did they realize how much this matters to me? Did I reveal something I shouldn't have? That internal interrogation can begin quietly. Sometimes it happens hours later, sometimes the following morning. And this is where the word shame becomes important. Shame is different from guilt. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame can feel more like, something about me was exposed. That distinction matters. Because the avoidant response may not be, I shouldn't have trusted this person. It may be, I shouldn't have let them see that part of me. Now the person isn't simply evaluating the conversation. They're evaluating themselves, their openness, their emotional needs, their dependence, their tenderness, their reaction, and perhaps most importantly, their loss of privacy. Because emotional privacy can become part of psychological safety. If I know what I feel, but nobody else knows, I can still decide what happens next. I can retreat. I can rationalize it. I can minimize it. I can tell myself it wasn't important. But once I've said it aloud, another person carries the evidence. They know, and I can't completely unknow that they know. This is why an avoidant can sometimes appear different after an unusually vulnerable conversation. Not because the conversation meant nothing. Sometimes it meant too much. The openness created a level of exposure they weren't prepared to sit with. So the mind begins trying to restore psychological distance. It may minimize the conversation. I was just tired. It wasn't that serious. I don't know why I said all that. You probably misunderstood me. Or they may mentally rewrite the event altogether. Because if the vulnerability can be reduced, the exposure can be reduced with it. And that is the strange paradox. The person may have genuinely wanted to be understood, but once they realize they were understood, they may suddenly want some of that visibility back. Not because they necessarily stopped caring, but because being seen can activate a completely different psychological need. The need to feel protected again. And this is where the aftermath becomes more complicated than the moment itself. Because now, they aren't only dealing with what they revealed, they're dealing with the fact that you remember it. And that changes everything. The next thing that can happen is subtle. The avoidant doesn't necessarily decide, I regret opening up. Instead, they may begin trying to reduce the emotional importance of what happened. This is where psychological self-protection becomes interesting. Because if the mind can convince itself that the moment wasn't significant, then the exposure doesn't have to feel significant either. So they may replay the conversation differently. What felt meaningful last night can suddenly seem excessive this morning. What felt honest can start feeling embarrassing. What felt like connection can begin to feel like a mistake. Not because the memory changed, but because their relationship to the memory changed. The emotional system has moved from openness back toward protection, and protection often asks a very different question. Not, was it good to be understood? But, how much did I reveal? That question can trigger intense self-monitoring. They may remember exactly how you responded. Did you look surprised? Did you become more affectionate? Did you ask another question? Did you seem worried? Did you look at them differently? Even a completely supportive reaction can become uncomfortable because sometimes the problem isn't rejection. It's being accurately seen. Imagine someone spending years communicating. I don't need much. Then one night, they admit that they actually needed you. That admission creates information. You now know there is a need beneath the independence. And once they know you have that information, their behavior may become more controlled. They may speak less, explain less, joke more, change the subject, or suddenly become extremely rational. It can look confusing from the outside. You may think, why are they acting like nothing happened? But psychologically, acting normal can be an attempt to make the vulnerable moment feel normal again. They are trying to return the relationship to familiar territory, the territory where nobody knows too much, where emotions can remain implied rather than spoken, where closeness exists, but doesn't require too much exposure. And this is where compartmentalization can enter the picture. A vulnerable moment can be placed into a mental compartment. Something like, that was then. We don't need to talk about it again. I don't want to make this a big thing. The compartment allows the person to preserve the relationship without having to remain emotionally exposed. But there is a problem. Compartmentalization doesn't erase the emotional experience. It simply moves it somewhere else. The feeling is still there. The memory is still there. And sometimes, the person becomes even more aware of it because they're trying not to think about it. That can create an internal contradiction. Part of them remembers the relief of finally saying it. Another part feels embarrassed that they said it. One part wants the connection. Another wants the privacy back. One part thinks, they understand me now. Another thinks, that was too much. That internal conflict can be exhausting. And sometimes the easiest way to resolve it is to create distance from the person who witnessed it. Not necessarily because that person did anything wrong, but because their presence is now associated with a version of the self that feels exposed. This is an important distinction. The person may not be escaping you. They may be escaping the version of themselves that appeared in front of you. The softer version, the frightened version, the needy version, the hopeful version, the version that admitted, I actually care. That version can feel unfamiliar, especially if someone has built their identity around being composed and self-contained. And when identity and behavior collide, shame can appear because now they have evidence that they're not as emotionally untouched as they sometimes believed. That can challenge the story they've told themselves. I can handle everything myself. I don't really need people. Relationships don't affect me that much. Then suddenly, one conversation proves otherwise, and the mind has to reconcile those two realities. That isn't always comfortable. Sometimes it produces irritation, sometimes silence, sometimes a sudden return to emotional neutrality, and sometimes a strange desire to make sure the other person doesn't bring it up again. Because if you bring up what they revealed, they have to become that exposed person again, and they may not be ready for that. This is why the response of the other person matters so much. If you react with pressure, the shame can intensify. If you repeatedly remind them of what they confessed, they may feel watched. If you demand another emotional conversation immediately, the original vulnerability can start feeling like a trap. But if you simply allow the moment to exist without exploiting it, something different becomes possible. The person learns that being seen doesn't automatically mean losing control, that revealing something doesn't mean surrendering their entire emotional world. That vulnerability doesn't have to become a permanent obligation. And that distinction matters enormously. Because healthy intimacy isn't supposed to mean you opened up once, so now you have to open up constantly. It means you showed me something real, and I don't need to punish you for it. That can be a completely different experience for someone who is accustomed to protecting themselves. And perhaps the most important thing to understand is this. The shame doesn't necessarily mean the vulnerability was wrong. Sometimes, the shame is simply the nervous system reacting to new emotional territory. A person can feel embarrassed by something that was actually deeply meaningful. They can wish they hadn't revealed something, while still secretly being grateful that they did. Both feelings can exist at the same time. And that is the uncomfortable middle ground we're often missing. Because vulnerability isn't always followed by clarity. Sometimes, it's followed by a psychological argument inside the person. One voice says, I finally let someone close. Another says, close enough. And somewhere between those two voices, the person decides what happens next. And this is where the aftermath can become even more confusing. Because once the initial shame settles, the avoidant may start trying to figure out what your reaction means. Not just what they said, but what you now think of them. That can create a quiet form of psychological surveillance. They may watch you more carefully. Did you become more attached? Are you treating them differently? Do you expect more from them now? Did their vulnerability change the balance between you? These questions may never be spoken aloud, but internally, they can become extremely important because vulnerability creates information, and information changes relationships. Before they opened up, they could keep certain parts of themselves private. You could only respond to what they showed you. Afterward, you have access to something deeper, and that can make them feel psychologically exposed, especially if they believe that emotional disclosure gives another person leverage. Not necessarily because you would actually use it against them, but because their nervous system may associate emotional dependence with reduced control. So they may begin watching for consequences. Maybe you become warmer. Maybe you ask about what they shared. Maybe you tell them that you're glad they trusted you. To you, that might simply be affection. To them, it can sometimes feel like confirmation that the disclosure mattered, and that can bring the shame back. So they may subtly reverse course. The conversation becomes something they don't want to revisit. They become more casual, more detached, more difficult to read. And you might wonder, did I imagine the connection? No, the vulnerable moment was real. But the person's ability to remain comfortable inside that vulnerability may be limited. That's the distinction. The issue isn't always whether they wanted closeness. Sometimes, it's whether they can tolerate being known after closeness happens. Because being known creates permanence. You now have a memory of them that they can't completely control. You saw the emotion before they could organize it. You heard the words before they could soften them. You witnessed something unedited. And that can feel threatening to someone who relies heavily on emotional self-management. So they may try to restore the old version of themselves, the composed version, the independent version, the person who doesn't need reassurance, the person who doesn't explain too much, the person who never seems affected. But here's the important part. That doesn't mean the vulnerable version disappears. It simply goes underground again. And sometimes, that hidden version becomes even more emotionally significant. Because now they know what it felt like to be understood. They know what it felt like to say something they normally keep hidden. They know what happened when they stopped managing the impression they were giving you. That memory can remain powerful, even if they never talk about it again. So if you've ever experienced someone becoming strangely guarded after revealing something deeply personal, don't automatically assume the moment meant nothing. Sometimes the opposite is true. The moment mattered enough to disturb the emotional structure they normally rely on. And that's why the most revealing part of vulnerability isn't always what someone says while they're opening up. Sometimes, it's what happens inside them after they realize, they saw me, and now they have to decide whether being seen is something they can survive or something they secretly want again. But there is something important to understand here. The goal isn't to make an avoidant feel ashamed of their shame. And it isn't to convince yourself that every moment of distance means they secretly regret losing you. The deeper point is this. Vulnerability can create a psychological aftershock. Someone can want connection, experience it, and then feel exposed by it. Those feelings can coexist. They don't cancel each other out. And if you are on the receiving end of this pattern, your instinct may be to chase the vulnerable version of them. You remember what they said. You remember the softness. You remember the moment when the wall came down. And you may think, if I can just get them back into that emotional space, they'll open up again. But that's where you can accidentally turn their vulnerability into pressure. You don't want to become the person who keeps saying, "Remember when you told me this? Why won't you talk like that anymore? What happened to the person I saw that night?" Because now the very moment that once felt safe starts feeling like evidence being held against them. Instead, let the moment breathe. If someone trusted you with something real, you don't have to immediately extract more from it. You don't have to demand another confession. You don't have to prove that they care. You don't have to turn one vulnerable conversation into a permanent emotional contract. Sometimes the safest response is simply allowing someone to discover, "I showed this person something real and nothing terrible happened." That experience can matter because over time, healthy vulnerability becomes less frightening when the brain learns that exposure doesn't automatically lead to judgment, loss of autonomy, or emotional demands. And this is also where your own boundaries matter. Understanding and avoidance shame doesn't mean tolerating emotional inconsistency forever. Compassion doesn't require you to accept being repeatedly shut out. You can understand what may be happening internally without abandoning what you need externally. That's the balance. You can give someone room without putting your life on pause. You can respect their defenses without becoming responsible for dismantling them. And you can recognize that their vulnerability was real without making their next emotional decision your responsibility. Because ultimately, you cannot make another person comfortable with being known. You can only create an environment where honesty isn't punished. They have to decide whether they are willing to stay present once the emotional exposure begins. And perhaps that's the real lesson hidden inside the vulnerability hangover. The person who opened up wasn't necessarily pretending. The person who became uncomfortable afterward wasn't necessarily pretending either. Both versions can be real. The openness was real. The shame was real. The desire for connection was real. And the instinct to protect themselves was real. The question is what they eventually do with that contradiction. Do they keep running from every moment that makes them feel exposed? Or do they slowly learn that intimacy doesn't require perfect emotional control? Because real closeness isn't built from never feeling vulnerable. It's built from discovering that vulnerability doesn't have to destroy your sense of self. And if you've ever been confused by someone who finally opened up, only to become guarded afterward, remember this. Their retreat may not erase what they revealed. Sometimes, the thing they're trying hardest to hide afterward is the very thing that was most honest. So if this helped you understand a relationship pattern you've struggled to make sense of, subscribe to the Inner Odyssey. Because here, we don't just look at what people do. We look underneath the behavior, at the psychological systems that make those behaviors possible. And if you've experienced that strange moment when someone finally let you see behind the wall, then seemed almost embarrassed that you saw it, leave a comment. They let me see them, not to chase the person, not to diagnose them, just to recognize the moment for what it was. Because sometimes understanding what happened is the first step toward finally deciding what you will do with what happened.